Welcome to Soul-utions with Dr. Mark Pitstick, providing soul perspectives for a new millennium and answering those age-old questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens after we die? What about God, heaven and hell? And most importantly, once we really know we're souls, how might we best live and treat one another? It's been said that first-hand experience transforms belief into knowing. I'll say that again. First-hand experience transforms belief into deep knowing. And our guest tonight is going to help you have a first-hand experience. If you follow some of what we'll be talking about tonight, our guest really needs no introduction. Another giant in the field of higher consciousness, near-death studies, a pioneer in helping us know without a doubt that there is much more to life than meets the eye. Dr. Raymond Moody, M.D., Ph.D., is the author of 6 books. Starting in 1975, the classic Life After Life, really the first pioneer in near-death experience studies. Also Reflections on Life After Life, Coming Back, The Light Beyond, Reunions, and most recently, The Last Laugh. Dr. Moody is a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and heads the Consciousness Studies Department there. He is a psychiatrist as well as a Ph.D. And with that, welcome, Dr. Moody.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be with you, Mark. How are you doing?
Wonderful. I should tell the listeners that we spent some time together about 2 months ago in Nevada. And so if you hear a deep caring and kinship there, it's there because this man is a mentor. And I think one of the most impressive things I came away with was, in addition to your, of course, huge intellect and all that you've done, not any ego that I could detect, and so much love and genuine caring and compassion. What a powerful combination. It's nice to see that modeled.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, and I reflect that right back to you.
Well, there's so much I want to cover with you tonight, but with an hour show, what I'd like to do is some justice to 2 of your books, Reunions, talking about the psychomantium, of course, and then The Last Laugh. And so let's start with The Last Laugh first. And if you would tell listeners a little just about what it is and what the topic is of that book.
Well, basically, I must say that after 30-something years, 35 years of exploring these near-death experiences, Mark, I really am convinced that this is a very powerful and important phenomenon. It's something that I think everybody is concerned with at some point in their life. I think especially when people lose a loved one or they suddenly go through a life crisis where they have to confront death for the first time. And so these are very important experiences. And because of the enormous appeal of them, unfortunately, a lot of the books that the listeners see on the market about this kind of thing are unfortunately kind of fabricated and then pumped up by these big commercial publishers in New York that carry very little for the truth. And what my new book, The Last Laugh, is about is basically trying to restore that balance and to enable people such as myself, who really are very sympathetic with the people who have paranormal experiences, to be able to look at these in some sort of rational way, and yet without falling prey to these various kinds of commercialism and the sensational claims that people make that are not really justified. And that basically is what the book is about. It's an entirely new way of thinking about paranormal phenomena that is rational and also has the very nice implication that the focus of this new approach is on how actually to enable people to have their own first-hand experiences so they won't have to trust what they hear from some expert who often isn't an expert.
Sure. On your website, and by the way, listeners, his website is www.lifeafterlife.com. You say about the last laugh, or someone says, 3 sects of true believers have dominated discussion about the supernatural. And with the last laugh, you're providing an alternative theory about the nature of the paranormal.
That's right. I think if you think about the last time you went to a big cocktail party where there was a lot of people with an interest, or just of all kinds of people, and if you were to bring up the subject of paranormal phenomena in that setting, you generally find 3 kinds of points of view. And those same 3 kinds of points of view are held on the professional level by the various people who call themselves the experts. Mm-hmm. And one point of view has it that, well, we can use these near-death experiences or other seemingly paranormal experiences to prove or to give some sort of evidence of a life after death. And that point of view is that of the parapsychologist. Then there's another group of people who call themselves the skeptics, who say that, oh, you know, if you tell them about your near-death experience, they say, oh, that's just your brain dying, or that's the chemistry of your brain. Mm-hmm. And the really wild thing about that is that actually, before I ever went to medical school, I got a Ph.D. in philosophy and was particularly interested in ancient Greek philosophy. And the idea of being a skeptic is something that comes from ancient Greek philosophy. And what a skeptic is a person who very vigorously pursues every question that you can possibly ask and really bears down on it, but then in the end refuses to draw a conclusion, and that's what being a skeptic means. Mm-hmm. Well, when you hear somebody at the cocktail party say, I'm a skeptic about near-death experiences, I think it's just the chemistry of the brain, you see, really that person has just contradicted themselves. That's not the position of a skeptic at all. And then the third group are the demonologists, the people that whatever wonderful experience you have are going to tell you that, oh, that's the the work of the devil, and justifying this by their alleged better knowledge than anybody else of the Bible and so on. Mm-hmm. And so what this new book does is that it steps out of that framework of those 3 points of view entirely to think of the paranormal phenomena as a recreational modality, or a form of recreation. And if you think about that word recreation, well, recreate. Sure. Recreate. And basically that is what I have tried to do over the last, well, quite a number of years now, is actually to devise methods whereby we can recreate these paranormal experiences. Mark, as you experienced yourself there when you came to Nevada, we now have developed a very reliable method that's based on archaeological discoveries from Greece of ancient ruins of these facilities the ancient Greeks had, where you could go and you could go through various sorts of preparation, and as a result of that, you would have an experience which you would take to be actually seeing and conversing with the spirit of a departed loved one. Yes. Right in front of your eyes while you were fully awake, actually seeing full color in 3 dimensions, a moving and often speaking representation of your loved one who had died. Well, for about 2,000 years, scholars didn't believe these stories that have been told to us by the ancient historians such as Herodotus and the ancient dramatists such as Aristophanes and Euripides and so on, and the travel writer Pausanias, the geographer Strabo, many other of the writers assure us that the ancient Greeks actually had ways of enabling you to see the dead. Well, we have now found through studying the archaeology of this place where they didn't exactly what they were doing, and guess what? It works. Yes. What I'm saying to you has actually now been verified by numerous psychologists all over the U.S. and other parts of the world too. And so yeah, absolutely, we do now have a reliable way of guiding people through a procedure, as a culmination of which they will actually seem to see and interact with a departed loved one.
I know in Nevada you were sharing various lithographs, pictures, and so on from the 19th century when mirror gazing and other, quote, paranormal experiences, practices were used as parlor games before people had TV and radios, and making the point that the paranormal is really not so odd and it's really normal. It's something that more and more people are sensing now.
Oh, yeah, I think that, basically, these things have been built into human beings for, I suppose, as long as there have been human beings. I kind of regret, in a way, after my book, Life After Life, came out, that a lot of people sort of looked at this as something new, but even in that book, what I tried to emphasize was that this is something that goes back literally to antiquity.
Yes.
Plato, for example, described near-death experiences which are very comparable to what we hear from patients in the emergency room today.
Beautiful. And we're kind of leading into the book reunions, but we have a break in about a minute and a half. Another thing that really struck me from our time together during your workshop is you told about when you were a young boy and you were watching, I believe, the Jack Parr show, and saw a book, ordered it and sent away, ordered it and read it. Could you tell that story, please?
You mean the story? Yeah, I used to be a fan, as I'm sure many listeners were, of Jack Parr, and many probably don't even remember him. But before Johnny Carson even, there was Jack Parr was the man who did the evening show. And I used to watch Charlie Weaver on that show, was one of my favorites. And one night I was watching, and they had a great show about a man who had been an imposter who went around claiming to be I remember one of the main ones he talked about was a Latin teacher. He told people he was a Latin teacher, so he actually got a job doing that. And he as he put it, he read one day ahead of the students, and that way developed a reputation as a Latin teacher, when really he was no such thing.
And you were about how old then?
I'm sorry?
You were approximately how old when you ordered that book?
Oh my goodness, I think that must have been about late 1950s, or maybe, because that was when I used to watch Jack Parr, so I must have been about 14.
Before the break, we were talking about Dr. Moody's watching Jack Parr, seeing about an interesting guest, hearing about a book about imposters and so on at a young age, sending off for it and reading it. And what I got from that was an indication of one of the indications of your soul's mission and a precursor to your interest in forensic psychiatry. I believe that we each have many missions as souls we come here to do, and it struck me when you told that was, you were starting to already at that young age glimpse how many boys that age would send away for the book and study it as you did.
Yeah, I have always been mostly a reader type. I remember the first book I ever checked out of the library when I was a kid was a book on astronomy, and that was when I was about 6 or 7. So yeah, I love to. But that book, I remember, called The Great Imposter. In forensic psychiatry, you see a lot of this. There are lots of people who are able to fool people just incredibly into almost anything. And unfortunately, as you can imagine, sometimes this sort of imposter syndrome leaks out into the world of the paranormal too, so that we see various kinds of charismatic figures going around who really are just mostly kind of making stuff up, but which have a ready audience on the New Age circuit. So that's something I think all of us who take this field seriously have to watch out for.
And that's why listeners have to use their own discernment, their own common sense when they hear something that doesn't make sense. It might be for a good reason. Let's talk about the book reunions, and I consider this to be so groundbreaking. I mean, your research on near-death experience, that's really enough for one lifetime, but that's not enough. And I understand you really got the past life regression ball rolling at some point and did some of that initial research. And now the psychomantium. I'm impressed. Could you tell people briefly about reunions, the psychomantium, what it's about, why it's really so important?
Well, yes. Basically, as I was saying earlier, through the ancient Greeks, I learned that there were these places in ancient Greece where you could go and you could go down into a chamber underneath the ground, and they had a method of bringing you into contact with your departed loved ones. When the archaeology site was excavated, and I read the report of what was in there, I realized from other research that I had been doing what the Greeks were up to. Basically, in this underground chamber, which was the central part of this complex underground, they had a long hallway, and in that hallway was the remnants of an enormous bronze cauldron, and it was surrounded by a banister to keep people from getting too close. And so when I read that, I realized from other ancient Greek sources that I had read that what this was all about was that they highly polished the inside of that brass cauldron and then presumably filled it up with a layer, presumably of olive oil would be the best thing to do under those circumstances, and then illuminated it indirectly with torches, which the carbon from the torch light has actually been found right there in this chamber. And since it would be illuminated indirectly, and people would be gazing into this clear optical depth as it would be, that I figured that after the proper preparation process, that what this was all about was mirror gazing. You know, many people, when they gaze into a clear optical depth, it could be a clear pond like the Cherokee shamans used, or it could be a polished steel mirror like the shamans in Tibet use, or a crystal ball like the gypsy woman and the fortune teller's tent. But many people actually do, when they gaze into an optical depth like that, will see really astonishing visions, full color, three-dimensional, moving. And so I set this up. I have a good friend named Bill Hay, who was a craftsman, and Bill built a booth in my research place in Alabama and even some of the stories, Mark, that we see filmed all the time actually originated in these oracles of the dead. The story of Orpheus, for example, was a story that was based in the ancient Greek oracles of the dead, and that constantly gets refilmed. Just in the past few years, it's been refilmed as a movie called Truly, Madly, Deeply in Britain, and it's been refilmed as The Titanic recently, and refilmed then after that as What Dreams May Come. You know, what we did was that when I realized what these people were doing in ancient Greece, I had a friend of mine, Bill Hay, build a booth for me, and there's a mirror in the front of this booth, and dark fabric hangs around from a frame that Bill built hanging from the ceiling, and this is in effect we used dark black velvet, and we had a comfortable easy chair sitting right in front of the mirror, and Bill took the legs off of the easy chair so that it would sit down close to the floor, and the mirror was hanging on the wall, and then behind the chair we have a little a single light bulb that's about the size of a ping pong ball, and that casts a very diffuse illumination. And when you turn the lights out in this room and you illuminate it with this little light bulb from behind, then after preparation, when people gaze into that mirror, they actually have visions that they interpret to be actually seeing and talking with their departed loved ones. The way we prepare them is that we just get them to tell us about the person who died. I ask them to very open-ended questions that lead them to talk about the person who had died and to bring up all their memories and so on. And this lasts about an hour or two. And then then I put them into this booth, and they gaze away into this optical depth of the mirror. And people very often say that they see their loved one first in the mirror sort of taking form, but then the apparition of the deceased loved one will actually move forward and in many cases actually come out into the room with the person and seem to talk. About 30% of our subjects will tell us that they hear the audible voice of the deceased person. And almost all the rest of them say that even though they don't hear a voice, that they have an intimate heart-to-heart or mind-to-mind communication with the person who's died.
Yes.
And I think perhaps the most astonishing part of this to me was that the subjects actually interpret this to be real. In other words, they don't appreciate this as a dream or as a fantasy, but rather the experience has on them the effect of a real experience. Now, I'm not implying, by the way, that therefore that means that it is a real experience, but the reason I think this is so impressive is that this is exactly what people who tell us who see apparitions spontaneously. So with this new method, what we have here is a reliable method whereby we can study the common human experience of seeing apparitions of the deceased under fairly controlled circumstances, and we're going to learn a lot more about apparitional experiences from this.
You know, in reunions, you give some statistics. I believe that 66% of widows see their departed husband within a year of his passing. 75% of parents will see their departed child within a year after their passing. Up to 1/3 of Americans, I believe, and Europeans admit to seeing a ghost at least once. Those are very high figures, and I wasn't aware that these sightings were that common.
Yes, I know. The reason why I think that we find those figures surprising is that we live in a society which for a long time sort of frowned upon these things, and so when people have these experiences, instead of telling others about them, they tend to shut up about it and just not to say anything. And that adds to the general impression that this is a rare experience. But many studies have shown us conclusively that the experience of seeing apparitions of the departed is really just a part of the grieving process. It is something that is so common that you can't put any label of abnormality on it. I think it's a perfectly normal human experience.
Sure. The paranormal has become normal. And you shared during our seminar some validation stories, some confirmation stories. For example, the French psychologist who said, you said is the editor of our equivalent of Psychology Today. Can you tell that story, please?
Well, yes, I have a good friend in France who is well known over there as a psychologist and a journalist. And some years ago, I told him about my procedure. This was about 10 years ago now, I guess. And then we had known each other for some time before that. But when he heard this, he just kind of thought, "Oh my God, Raymond has slipped off the deep end." But a couple of years later, after my book had been published in France, I got a call from him, and he told me that he had had this experience himself. A friend of his, a woman, had lost a loved one and was having quite a bit of grief difficulties about this. And so she knew that I was a friend of his, and she read my book, and she asked my friend Eric if he would set this up for her. And he did, and he set this up in his apartment in Paris. And he left her in this room for an hour, which is what we normally recommend. And he said that when he went into this room, his friend waved him away and said, "No, don't come in here now. Something is going on." And my friend said he looked up and he saw the apparition too. And as he put it, he heard the apparition talking to him. So yes, once in a while, the facilitator also sees the apparition. When you read, for example, in the story that Herodotus wrote about the Oracle of the Dead, it's very plain that more than one person saw the apparition of the deceased person simultaneously.
Which very much strengthens the validity of the experience, makes it more than just a person's wishful thinking or imagination.
Well, it's, I think the experience of going through this preparation must be very powerful for the guide or the facilitator as well. So, in terms of the psychological dynamic, we can sort of understand how this could be, I think. There have been other cases, Mark, where things have happened which really seem quite astonishing. Our mutual friend, Diane Archangel, who's a psychotherapist who learned how to do this some years ago at my place and then took it back to Texas, where she's a hospice counselor, has now done this with probably many more people than I have. And she had an experience some years ago where a woman who came to her because she had been having a great deal of difficulty over the loss of her father. And so this woman went into this booth and saw her father and had a conversation with her deceased father. But then when she came out of this room, she told Diane, the facilitator, that she was puzzled by something her father had said, because her father had told her that she was going to have a child. And this was very surprising to this woman, because the woman had been told by her physicians that she would never be able to have a child. And so my friend Diane was suggesting to her, well, perhaps this is symbolic. I mean, a birth doesn't always mean a literal birth. But in fact, several months later, this woman got pregnant, and about 1 year after her experience in the Psychomanteon, actually did have a healthy infant. And so that one has been one of the ones that's really, I think, quite startling.
And especially taken together, constitute impressive proof, along with all the other proofs, past life regression, near-death experiences, and so on. I think one of the other fascinating aspects of the Psychomanteum is the number of people who may or may not have a successful contact with a departed loved one in the booth, but then later on, perhaps in the more relaxing environment of their home, do indeed then contact their departed loved one. Can you tell more about that, please?
Yes, Mark, about a quarter of the people I found when I was doing this very actively, whether they did or did not have an experience when they were in the booth, very frequently would have a follow-up experience that evening when they got home, and sometimes having an experience of seeing a full-blown apparition of a departed loved one. Now, one thing I do want to say to the listeners who might be hearing this, one thing is that what we're talking about here is something that actually has been in our American culture until very recently. I found some postcards in my hometown of Anniston, Alabama, when I was doing this research, that show the same thing and show that very conclusively that up until about 100 years ago in the United States, this was a very common piece of knowledge, that you could set up a mirror and by candlelight gaze into the mirror and you could see loved ones who had passed away. So this is something that has been in our culture for a long time. But at the same time, I want to say that this is something that, when it occurs, is really, really quite astonishing. It's far more realistic than you might expect, and far more emotional. And so, by all means, I think that if people are going to do this, they should not do it alone. I think you need to have someone there to ask you these questions and who can be there with you to support you there through a very, very emotional experience. Because when people come out of this room after seeing and talking with relatives who've died, they actually are crying, not out of distress, but great tears of joy and release. So it stands to reason, I think it's just common sense, that this is something that you need to do with companions that you know can help you talk about your feelings after this very emotional experience.
Yes, and listeners can, via your website, which again is www.lifeafterlife.com, can access resources to find out then where are these various centers around the country. So we'll talk more about this after the break. Again, you're listening to Dr. Raymond Moody on Soul-utions. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the last segment of Soul-utions. We're interviewing Dr. Raymond Moody, and again his website, www.lifeafterlife.com. We've been talking about two of his books, The Last Laugh and Reunions, but they're all excellent. Life After Life, Reflections on Life After Life, Coming Back, The Light Beyond. These are bestsellers. Your library should have them. All the bookstores should have them. So make sure you access these books and find out the good news that sets you free, that gives you that peace that passes all understanding, that helps you know without a doubt that you are a soul, you are an eternal spirit. There's much more to life than meets the eye, and that's what we want to talk about a bit in this last segment. Dr. Moody, what words of comfort, reassurance do you have for those listeners who have lost loved ones, especially tragically, and especially children passing is one of the toughest things to understand?
It sure is, Mark. And, I lost my first child when I was just 25 years old, and that was just a horrible, horrible situation.
Yes.
And one that I didn't really, at the time, in 1970, men weren't supposed to cry. I mean, it was a horrible thing. But fortunately, over the last couple of decades, I think people are now more willing to talk about the grieving process and to acknowledge those feelings of grief and so on. Mm-hmm. And what I would say to people who are going through a grief, it's really happening a lot now with baby boomers, for example, we're in that phase of our life where we're beginning to lose our parents and so on. And what I would say is that, number one, don't be discouraged by these people who tell you that the idea of a life after death is all ridiculous and so on and unscientific. In fact, the question of an afterlife is one of the oldest and most respectable questions in the history of Western thought. Mm-hmm. And we now are on the verge, I think, of developing techniques where we can actually enable people to have this experience of seeing a loved one who's passed away, at least of having an experience which is indistinguishable from that. It certainly seems real when it's going on. And the nicest thing that I hope will come out of this is that we will be able to use this to help people who are going through grief.
Yes.
Because I'm sure, as many of the listeners will agree, it is one of the toughest problems of human life, I think, when you lose a loved one to death.
And although scientifically we can't say without a doubt that there is an afterlife, as we discussed at dinner, there is just so much evidence that points at it that really we're getting very close, and we personally are both totally convinced.
Well, what I would say about that is that I think that, yes, we are on the verge of having techniques that will enable people to make up their own minds. Mm-hmm. Because when you have your own personal experience of this, then who can contradict you? It's once you have experienced it for yourself, it takes it out of that speculative realm and makes it a part of someone's experience. Then in a way, there's, it's as though there's no denying.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, we have 30 seconds left. How would you like to be remembered?
Well, I think the main way I would like to be remembered is as a good father to my children and and a good husband and a good friend to my friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm. Well, I certainly appreciate the time we've spent together, and thank you again so much for taking time from your busy schedule.
Mark, this has been really wonderful, and I hope I can be with you again one day.